Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be involved with the 2021 Nebraska Food Summit. I am Cecil Stewart. I am the founder, principal operator, CEO of the Joslyn Institute for Sustainable Communities. We organized the Joslyn Institute in 1996 with offices in both Lincoln and Omaha. I would like to introduce my fellow panelists to you. Tim Rinne, who founded the Holly Food Gardens in Lincoln and is on the Nebraska and Lincoln Food Policy Councils. Next will be Mickey Esposito, who is Executive Senior Policy Advisor to the Mayor of Lincoln. And thirdly, Jerry Cornett, who with his wife Rinne owns and operates Lake House Farms and Prairie Plate Restaurant just a few miles in the countryside north of Waverly, Nebraska. To begin, what is sustainability and how does food relate to that? The original sustainability language can be traced to 1987 when the UN organized a World Commission on Environment and Development with an intent to spread the impact and need for sustainability planning. The mantra that resulted from their activities, and I quote, is to live a healthy and secure life in harmony with nature, and at the same time, not impacting the loss of resources for future generations to satisfy their own needs. In that context, they encouraged the three domains of environment, social conditions, and economics to be considered in all development issues simultaneously. In about 2005, the Joslyn Institute was invited by the planning department of the city of Omaha to study the issues of growth management for Omaha and Douglas County and a surrounding 60-mile radius. We quickly and dramatically identified that those three domains in and of themselves were not adequate, sufficient information sources to develop complete sustainability strategies and plans. We therefore added the domains of technologies and public policy. And consequently, since 2005, have been operating studies, advice, and counseling and communications around the five domains of environment, social, cultural, technologies, economics, and public policy. There is, of course, all of those five domains are impacted by local, regional, and international contexts. There's a trilogy of sustainability that we must begin by considering the planet, the communities, and the human species. And in addition, there are the more recent contexts of what I call the four pandemics of climate change, health pandemic, economic stress, and social insecurities. It is in that domain and contextual characteristic that food turns out to be essential and central to all 7 of those contextual considerations. Therefore, I think it's entirely appropriate and highly necessary that we consider in our planning for local food systems how we can make them all work together in a sustainable way. First, I'd like to invite Tim Rinne to give you his thoughts on the essential nature and characteristics for food systems.
Thank you, Cecil, and thank you all who are listening for being supporters of local food. As you all know, there are lots of reasons to support local food. There's taste. Local is fresher, it's more wholesome, it's a foodie's dream. Then there's health. Fresher and more wholesome is actually more nutritious, and so it's good for our bodies. But it's also good for business. All right, supporting local producers boosts our local economy and keeps our food dollars in our communities. And then there's stewardship. Local food is good for stewardship. It's not always true, but oftentimes you're going to find local residents are going to be less inclined to foul their nest because this is where they live. And they're not absentee owners. These are people that are going to want to pass on a healthy environment to their children. But then there's one more reason for supporting local food, and we don't give it much truck. That's food security. Now, 12 years ago, if you had asked me what food security was, I would have looked at you blankly because I did not know. I had been a dedicated, a devout, a religious eater for 50 years. You could probably count the number of meals that I had missed on one hand, all right? But I had never thought about this bigger question of where my food came from. How did it get there? Well, food security, as the definition from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has it, is that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Well, that's pretty wonky language, but the upshot of it all is that it's a good description of food security from a consumer perspective, from the perspective of the eater. Can everyone get enough to eat anytime they're hungry? That should be the bottom line. But there's a second meaning to food security, and it's a supply-based one. It focuses on the broader, more system-wide issues of food production and distribution. Can we produce and distribute all of the food needed to meet local, regional, and national demand, not just today, but for the future? How do we ensure that there will always be enough food? Now, as a lifelong faithful eater, okay, I never thought about that big picture. I just ate, and it wasn't until 2008 that I got my awakening, and it was a rude one. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the international authority for climate science, announced that climate change is actually going to have a negative impact on our food supply. Hotter temperatures, droughts, wildfires, floods, storms, diseases, pests, they're all going to make it harder to grow food. This is a challenge that we're going to have to address. Now, the foodie in me, the guy that likes to eat 3 times a day, this kind of alarmed me. So for the first time in my life, I started digging into what is this story about food security? And I came across a phrase I'd never heard before: just-in-time delivery. This is actually the food industry's distribution policy, is they make sure that stores and restaurants have everything they need for 72 hours. And consequently, these stores and restaurants, as a rule, don't really have more than 3 days inventory on supply because they just wait for the trucks to come in. Well, this same year, 2008, I came across a story about a British member of Parliament from the House of Lords, who is a gentleman farmer from Somerset, England. His name is Lord Cameron of Dillington, and he was then and still is the co-chair of the United Kingdom's all-party parliamentary group on agriculture and food for development. And Lord Cameron had this to say. He said that even advanced industrial technological nations like the United States and Great Britain are just 9 meals from anarchy. Now, when I heard this, I thought, what's 9 meals from anarchy? Well, it turns out in 2005, Lord Cameron was sitting in his perch in Parliament, and he was watching live footage of what was happening in New Orleans, Louisiana, as Hurricane Katrina was slamming that poor city. And there were, as you will recall, a bunch of people could not get out. They were marooned there, all right? Flooding was everywhere. Transportation corridors were destroyed. They couldn't get out, and the food trucks couldn't get in. And so what Lord Cameron said is that the first day, meals 1 through 3, everybody who's trapped in the city races to the grocery store and loads up. The second day, meals 4 through 6, everybody races back to the grocery stores and cleans out the shelves. And the third day, meals 7 through 9, Lord Cameron said, after the trucks can't get in and the people are still trapped there, you will have rats, mayhem, and maybe even murder. All it takes is just 3 days for the veneer of civilization to be peeled off. Food security, it turns out, is actually a matter of national security. So, how secure are we? Well, in our global food system, the average bite of food that we put in our mouth travels 2,000 miles to get there. 1 out of 5 bites actually comes from outside the country. Here in Nebraska, 90% of the money that Nebraskans spend on food leaves the state. It doesn't stay in our local economy. And you say, well, how is that possible? We're an agricultural powerhouse. We're the breadbasket of the world. It turns out that we don't grow food for humans here. We grow feed for livestock. And you and I as humans do not sit down to plates of field corn and soybean meal. Then in 2009 as well, it turns out that the Obama administration sent a State Department official over to Switzerland. And they wanted to meet with the Nestle Corporation, which is the largest food corporation in the entire world. And they sat down with Nestle and said, tell us about, the security of our food supply. And Nestle said, well, we've been looking at that. And here's what we think, is that by 2025, you're going to have 1/3 of the world facing fresh water shortages. And by 2025, you're going to have 30% of the world facing cereal grain shortages. That's your rice, that's your wheat, that's your corn. 2025, folks, is 4 years from now. That same year in 2009, you had the United Nations putting out their predictions for what world population growth was going to be by 2050. And they concluded we were easily going to surpass 9 billion people. But food demand would increase 60% to be able to feed that new audience. So that means that while Nestle is telling us that our food supply is going down, the UN is telling that our population growth is going up. That doesn't add up. Then in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a special report in the aftermath of the Paris Climate Agreement in December of 2015. And they were supposed to analyze what every nation in the world was doing in terms of meeting its target for cutting its carbon. And what they found out is that there wasn't a single country on Earth that had met their target. So what they said, folks, if we're going to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius so that we don't have runaway climate change and we don't have the climate spiraling out of control, that means that in the decade between 2020 and 2030, the world is going to have to cut half of its greenhouse gas emissions, an average of over 7% a year. Well, here's the thing. If you want to cut half of your greenhouse gas emissions, you have to cut half of your lifestyles. And for Americans in particular, where a middle-class American lives better than 90% of the world's population, we're the ones that are going to see the biggest hit to our lifestyles. Now, The Lancet is the premier medical journal in the entire world. It's based in the United Kingdom. And The Lancet was looking at all of the data that I've just spelled out for you here. And they said, wow, if we're going to make sure that everybody has a nutritious diet and gets what their body needs to live, to have that food security definition of, being able to live the way you want, if everybody's going to be able to get what they need nutritionally, everybody has to eat lower on the food chain if they're not already doing it. Everybody has to move to a plant-based diet, and everybody gets no more than the equivalent of 1.5 hamburgers per week. That is not going to be an easy sell in Nebraska or anywhere. That is a major shift in our worldview, And since World War II, if you live in a city, you don't think about your role in the food chain as being a producer. We're not doing victory gardens any longer. You think about your role in the food chain and your role in the food system as an eater. That's your job. What do? I eat. Jerry Cornett grows, I eat. But that gravy train is ending. The days of counting on someone else to produce all of our food are coming to a screeching halt. Starting now, everybody is going to have to re-engage with the food production system. We're going to have to pitch in, try to grow what we can, from tearing up our lawns to plant gardens, to gardening in containers, to buying local food from farmers like Jerry. We have to start pulling our weight, and if we expect to have regular meals in the future, localizing our food supply is the most prudent step that we can take to ensure our food security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Dramatic projections, dramatic reality, and the absolute need for action. Mickey Esposito is up next and will describe some of that proposed action that Lincoln, Nebraska is attempting to put in place in the relationship to food systems. Mickey?
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Cecil, for having us and pulling us all together. I want to go ahead and do a screen share so I can present some materials to everyone. So just bear with me a second here. And hopefully everyone is seeing Resilient Lincoln in front of them. Can I get a head nod? Great. Okay. Well, that was an incredible background of information from Tim Rinne, who is an expert in this realm. And one of my jobs at the City of Lincoln and working with the mayor is to ask ourselves, what can the city do to build a more resilient local food system? Conventionally, you know, cities don't generally get involved in food unless it's from a regulatory standpoint. But we are looking at actions that the city can take to create and build partnerships for more resilient local food right here in the heart of America. So I am charged with leading an initiative called Resilient Lincoln. And when we look at the definition of resilience and what it means, essentially what we're talking about is our ability to maintain systems through a hazardous event or some kind of crisis or trauma. But it's also our ability to bounce back from that event, in addition to even adapting or transforming through that event, innovating. And coronavirus is actually a really good example of innovation. We now gather through means, through like Zoom and Teams virtually. So we have had a traumatic event and crisis that we've had to maintain systems through. We've had to bounce back from and also innovate and find transformation in. So that's what we look at when we define resilience. In 2019, Mayor Gaylor Baird commissioned a study to understand climate change and what that would mean in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so we were taking a look at a projection of climate by the year 2050. And some of the things that we were finding is that through this climate study was that Lincoln, Nebraska would be experiencing 2 to 5 degrees warmer temperatures than today, 10 to 20 additional days annually with a high temperature greater than 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 to 20% increase in winter and spring precipitation totals, 5 to 10% drier summers than today, and 15 to 30% increase in heavy precipitation, including multi-day extreme precipitation events that would increase in severity. And so what we're seeing is we're going to have longer, hotter summers during that growing season of food, but we're also going to have wetter, more extreme events during the spring and the fall, and even through the winter. So we're going to have a lot of water when we don't want it, and we're going to have no water when we need it most. What this presents to us are climate risks, and taking a look at those risks are really important when wanting to develop actions to address those risks. We know that flooding will increase. We know that we're experiencing drought and will experience more events around drought. Lincoln also has a single source of water supply through the Platte River, so we have to address looking for a second source. And with all of those events, there are cascading sort of consequences and vulnerabilities, like public health impacts. How are vulnerable populations impacted by these risks? What happens to our financial systems and our workforce resources? Do city policies need to change? Antiquated policies, antiquated rules and regulations to be more nimble and flexible and mindful of climate change? What happens with our transportation systems and our use and reliance on fossil fuels? We're here to talk about food supply and food insecurity risks, natural resources. How do we maximize those natural resources to help with these climate risks? And wrapped up in all of this is really public awareness. How do we build more education opportunities and awareness in our community about these risks and what will happen as a result of climate change in Lincoln? We've learned a great deal from this coronavirus pandemic. Both good and bad things have occurred in our world. Sudden shocks to the system have enormous consequences, and we've all experienced those consequences. Disasters have cascading effects. Interruptions to the food supply is a real threat. Vulnerable populations have been hit the hardest. People who are already suffering have suffered more because of the pandemic. But we have relied a lot on social capital. There's some benefit to what we've learned because we know that we can rely on our neighbors and help each other get through these types of events. What we've also learned, and just going back to how vulnerable populations are hit the hardest, is this notion of equity, diversity, inclusion, how people are experiencing these events. And environmental justice is a major part of what we're trying to bring awareness around and enlighten people. The fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This has become a huge part of our climate action planning exercise. And there are so many intersections with climate and climate change and socioeconomic trends. Climate change really exacerbates problems for people who are already experiencing things like poverty, disproportionality, aging, immigration, automation, migration, and food insecurity. So what we're taking a look at is how climate change and environmental justice intersects with these socioeconomic trends. I want to share some data a little bit with you on poverty rates in Lincoln. Approximately 30% of households in Lincoln are at or near poverty. 7 census tracts are categorized as being in extreme poverty. And then you have a problem of disproportionality. Poverty rates are not evenly distributed across racial categories. Black populations have a poverty rate twice as high as whites in Lincoln, followed by Hispanics and Asians. And 6 of the 7 neighborhoods in extreme poverty have a higher percentage of racial and ethnic minorities compared to Lincoln overall. And then you add on food insecurity. Food supply in Lincoln, if we take a look at food supply in Lincoln, 13% of residents in Lancaster County experience food insecurity right here in the breadbasket. The COVID crisis has shown us how easily food shortages can occur when supply chains are interrupted. We've all experienced seeing those empty shelves. We've witnessed the line of cars and patrons at food banks during the pandemic. In addition, global crop yields could decline in a climate-altered future, which could create instability and availability of groceries locally. And so all of the things that Tim was bringing to light, that we need to grow food locally, is really an emerging and important issue. Just as a reminder, we have about 3 days food supply in our grocery system here in Lincoln. So I want to share this context again about these compounding issues that vulnerable populations particularly are experiencing. This is a map showing median energy costs in the red, pink, and yellow areas, median energy costs divided by median income. This is showing how unaffordable utility rates are to people in these neighborhoods. And they're likely living in homes in the core of our city that are not energy efficient. If I also take our floodplain maps and I overlay them, this is the 100-year floodplain in the light blue, and the darker blue is the 500-year floodplain, and I overlay that over poverty data by census tract, the red and yellow areas. We're just seeing that these folks who are experiencing multiple risks and vulnerabilities, they're bearing more of the environmental burden in our community because of these overlapping issues. So in urban areas like these as well, there's a lack of green space to grow gardens. There's a lack of community grocery stores to buy fresh local food. And so again, you're just compounding issues for people. So what do we do about it? What does the city do to act in order to mitigate and adapt to climate change and food insecurity issues? Well, the achievement of any great undertaking begins with a vision. And so the Climate Action Plan for the City of Lincoln really has some ambitious goals. First of all, we want to address greenhouse gas emissions and reduce them 80% by 2050. But we also need to really work toward building more resiliency to the climate hazards we'll face. So it's not just about reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but also building up our resilience in vulnerable neighborhoods, for example. And we also need to be considerate of climate directions in our rules and our regulations, our policy documents, and our ordinances. We always need to take into account climate change and environmental justice as we're creating more policy for the City of Lincoln. So in the Climate Action Plan, it's a very comprehensive plan. We have 8 climate action areas. And so, yes, we will be talking about and addressing energy, transportation, economic development, improving protections in the floodplain, in addition to making sure there's a second source of water supply. We also want to address natural climate solutions to sequester carbon and enhance forests and prairie and other open spaces in our city. We want to reduce waste. And we also want to educate people and bring awareness around climate change and how it impacts their lives. But right here in the middle of our page here is building a resilient local food system. And the city as an institution actually being a part of that. Conventionally, again, we've taken the viewpoint that we regulate food through our health departments, we permit production of or farmers markets and events like that, but really we want to be a part of actually building resilience and enhancing local food. And so what do we do? What can we do? Well, ironically, the city actually owns a lot of land. The city currently has about 1,700 acres that it holds in order to protect and preserve infrastructure. This is an example of Jensen Park, which is about Yankee Hill Road, south of Highway 2. And it's about 30 acres of land near Moore Middle School. You'll recognize that right here, the new middle school in the southeast quadrant of the city. And on this land, we grow row crops, corn and soybeans, but we also hay it. But we took a long, hard look at what can the city do to actually not only work in a more sustainable way, but can we also look at this land as an opportunity to partner to create food that humans will actually eat rather than food for feed. So one of the things we're looking at is evaluating our city farm management contracts and requiring sustainable regenerative agriculture practices. So yes, this area is already no-till, but we also need to make sure that we're putting multi-species cover crops, so enhancing biodiversity of this land and not just having monocrops cover the land. We want to reduce the use of synthetic chemicals and toxic pesticides, as well as GMO-type seeds. So these are the types of sustainable practices and non-conventional farming practices that the city really can control right now. What this does is increases crop yield, it lowers production costs, and it can really work to sequester carbon by enhancing the health of the soil. But there's a further step we can take here. We can even evaluate opportunities on these city-owned properties currently in row crop production for potential urban commercial ag production. And so currently we're identifying a partner like Community Crops to act as a land manager. And we'll also consider some reduced lease rates on these lands and have a local food producer using sustainable regenerative agriculture practices to grow local food. The other thing that the city is doing is it's obtaining Brownfield site assessment grants through the state and the federal government. And what we do is we assess these vacant lots. Now, most vacant lots that the city owns aren't developable. They're these small tracts of land. And if we can just assess them for any environmental contamination, make sure they have a safe bill of health, then we can use those parcels for community gardens or urban agriculture. And currently the city is partnering with the People's City Mission and the Community Action Center to do just that, to grow a garden in the backyard of the People's City Mission. So people who are served by the People's City Mission can have access to fresh food. A couple of other things we do is provide grants and assistance through CDBG to Community Crops. We do that annually. And then we're also wanting to maintain a database of all city-owned property within the 3-mile jurisdiction that would be available for community gardens or urban agriculture. So the point here is that the city can do a lot to shape this issue, to help its community. It doesn't have to just wear a regulatory hat or see things through rules and regulations, but rather serve as a partner to others who are trying to produce local food and build resilient local food systems.
Thank you very much, Mickey. Fantastic vision and terrific for Lincoln to have a progressive administration leading the development of our local food system. Next, I invite Jerry Cornett to give us insight into the producer's conditions.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I guess this will be a little follow-up to what Tim and Mickey talked about, but let me start with a couple things about the state, certainly the state of agriculture and local food agriculture in Nebraska in general. Tim mentioned it, 10% of the food that we actually eat, we grow here or produce here in some way, and that's meat, that's vegetables, that's dairy. Not very agricultural focused, a lot more on commodities. In fact, about 40% of the corn that is produced in this country actually goes to ethanol. One of the things we have here, though, in what we call the breadbasket is Nebraska, certainly Kansas, definitely Iowa. Some of the richest agricultural land on earth is right here. The climate creates a few challenges. Water, not so much. If you've ever been through the San Joaquin Valley in California, you know what water, how it can shape politics in ways that it doesn't necessarily do here. So we have the water, we have the soil. We have farms that are willing to do this. What they don't have right now, and this is based on about 7 years of my growing, and is a sustainable market for those products. And when I say market, I'm not talking about the farmer's market. I'm talking about consumer demand for those products. And when we have folks come out to our restaurant, and what we thought was going to happen was a lot of folks like Tim that are very conscious about what they eat, and they were coming out and they came out and we loved it. The pleasant surprise we had for folks that wanted to come out here and eat, because we are a very local food restaurant, was a lot of the retired farmers. And one of the comments that I used to hear all the time when I talked with them is, you know, we used to eat this way. We used to have this system around Lincoln of dairies, of poultry producers, of pork producers and beef, and what they used to call a truck farmer that would drive a truck into town and sell the vegetables off the back of the truck. They didn't need a permit. They just found somewhere to do it, and they sold it. We used to eat this way. We know how to do this. But we moved away from it because we chased the almighty dollar. Cheapness became the #1 priority when it came to feeding this country. And we're paying the price now, not just from a sustainability perspective, as in, are we polluting the land? I'll leave that one for somebody else to discuss. But from a health perspective, the results are unmistakable and undeniable. Cheaper food has caused the health crisis in America to become so acute. And one of the reasons is because we don't eat the way we used to eat. A lot of the rest of the world does. So what does that mean here in Nebraska for producers? I see a local food system that is not thriving. It's barely surviving. Most of the farmers I know are actually scaling back. Even large-scale beef and pork producers are having a difficult time in this environment. And when I say large scale, 1,000 acres plus, because the almighty squeeze. Now, we live in a capitalist system. I mean, we just have to acknowledge that this system, if we want to change any of the things we just talked about changing, it has to be in the context of a capitalist system. That capitalist system has to be able to create a demand for these products, because right now we don't have that demand. We're just one of many farms that is not going to take that next risk and that next leap to grow more, produce more, because there just isn't a market for it, and the capital costs on a farm, and it doesn't matter if you're a 1 acre vegetable farm or a 10,000 head of cattle confined area feeding operation, the economics are still the same. It's a very capital intensive business with a very small return, which means very high risk. You'll either get a grant to try to mitigate that risk, or you're not going to take the risk to offer more food unless I know that there is a demand for it in some way. And demand, in the way I look at them, the way the farmer looks at them, is what price can I get for that pound of tomatoes, that pound of ground beef? But is that enough to justify? And so right now we're barely surviving. And in fact, many are cutting back. And I'll give you a little anecdote to leave because I know we want to get to a discussion. I saw a Facebook thread the other day on a new place to process meat opening up in southeast Nebraska. Now, during the pandemic, and this made things really acute, you might have noticed a few shortages here and there in your grocery store for ground beef and chicken and a lot of other things. You might have noticed that anybody that was selling local meats was having a hard time keeping it on the shelf and getting slots in the meat locker to slaughter their products so that it can be sold. So a few folks opened up, and one of the first comments on it, when somebody looked at the prices and said, I don't see how I can pay that when I can go down the street to big box store X and get it for $1. And they were talking about ground beef, $1.89 a pound. If you're going to compare the $1.89 ground beef to what they're offering in terms of resilience, locality, probably a better quality, and the way we used to eat, then we're fighting a losing battle. There's no way we can compete with that. There's no way that I can compete with somebody that's going to discount meat to get you into the store to buy other things, and the way the model works in a grocery store. So if that's going to be the primary consideration as we look at the consumer market, as it has been for the last several decades, this really isn't going to get any further. We can pump a lot of money into it, but we're not going to get more farms, more diversity of farms, more diversity of product until we do something about the consumer demand. And with that, I'll leave it for questions now, I guess.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. This is the crux of our challenge, I think, is in the economic and market domain. We have willing, capable, and as you point out, the most fertile soils and plenty of water for production and the energy to produce. We will welcome questions. I'll leave it to the session moderator to give you instructions about either submitting or having live questions. And with that, we'll take a short break and be with you on the 11th in the afternoon. Thank you so much.